Yes, very much. Thank you very much. Yes, very pleased to be joining you from Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Hope you can see my my slides. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you also very much for the invitation to speak at the spring conference. I'll be talking to you about the spatial aspects of the circular economy on the basis of a study. The scenario study we've been doing for the Netherlands. But let me start by saying something about the institute I'm working for, and maybe also a little bit more about myself, if I may. So, yeah, it's a research institute, about 250 staff, and we're mainly doing research in the fields of environment, nature, sort of biodiversity as well, landscape, spatial policy and spatial planning. And we're doing this research to contribute to improving the quality of political and administrative decision making here in the Netherlands. So we're part of the central government actually, but wholly independent. So we can be quite critical of government policy as well, but normally we are quite constructively critical, but we can be quite critical. So these are the strategic themes we've formulated. So climate change, energy transition, nature, landscapes, biodiversity, circular economy, and spatial planning, and urban and regional development. So my own field of research is actually urban and regional development. So I'm a development economist and an economic geographer by training. And I actually spent about 9 years in the UK. So first doing my PhD in economic geography in Newcastle, and then I worked as a researcher at Cambridge and Southampton for a number of years before returning to the Netherlands about three and a half years ago. So anyway, I'm familiar with the context of the UK, I think. Yeah, I'm actually rather new to this field of circular economy, but I've learned a lot in the last, say, 2 years or so. So what I will be talking about are these questions. So what are the spatial consequences of the transition to a circular economy? So in terms of land use, locations, transport flows. So, and also the other way around, right? What are the key conditions with respect to space that sort of facilitate the transition to a circular economy? And then what does that mean for policy? So, and all of this in the context of the stated ambitions of the Dutch government, right? The economy is to be fully circular and climate neutral by 2050. But there are quite varying views of what that actually entails. So what a circular economy could or should look like, and there's still many uncertainties. And there's actually very little research. So looking at the spatial aspects of the circular economy from a sort of comprehensive perspective. So there is some work on circular cities, or there's work on industrial ecology and what that means for business parks, or there's also studies on individual sectors like food systems or construction, or and the spatial aspects of that. But sort of this taking it all together, there's very little work on that. So I would say we've been doing some really quite pioneering stuff, if I'm being modest. So this research is part of a much bigger study. So I'll be talking briefly about that, and then I'll present the findings from the research and the 4 scenarios and some conclusions. So the biggest study is called the Spatial Outlook, or 2023. So we're doing this every 4 years or so. And in Dutch, it's called the ruimtelijke verkenning, and it's just been published last week, actually. Unfortunately, it's still all in Dutch. I think we will be having an English translation of at least sort of the management summary and the main findings at some point. But for now, it's only available in Dutch, and it's available on this website. And well, the study looks at spatial development of the Netherlands until 2050. And the main aim is to inform the further development of national and regional planning frameworks here in the Netherlands. So it looks at spatial development across a comprehensive set of themes. I will say a bit more about this in a minute. And it uses these 4 scenarios, and these scenarios are not organized along uncertainties as you may be used to, but they're called normative scenarios. So they're structured around sort of different worldviews, different values, and sort of different actors which can become dominant. And then the priorities will be different, and the interaction with some of the main developments in terms of technology or globalization will be different. There will be a different type of engagement with these, which also means that the development of spatial patterns will be different, and the questions that you face for spatial planning will be different. And what you get out of this are sort of points of attention for policy, certain no regret options for policy, sort of policy measures you would do in every scenario, but also sort of clarity about sort of what are the main points of contention and where do you really have to make choices, and what are the alternatives, and what are the consequences of these different alternatives. Yes. So there is we've also made some maps. We've drawn some maps for each of the scenarios, and they're available on the website as well. So you may want to take a look at this, so that you can play around with these maps a little bit. It's also all in Dutch, but hopefully you can make some sense of it. I mean, Dutch is not so different from English. Anyway, there's an invitation to take a look at our website. So these are the themes we've covered in our study, and these are the names of the four scenarios, and sort of in brackets the values which are central to each of these scenarios. So I won't explain these scenarios in depth. I don't think there's time for that, but I think it's important to note that in each of these scenarios, that there is the ambition to achieve a circular economy in 2050, but the way in which this is done varies between these 4 scenarios, and it varies along these parameters. So we've constructed these 4 scenarios using these 6 parameters. So the sort of the decrease in consumption through less consumption, or through the sharing economy, more reuse, repair, refurbishment, or modular construction, through which you can sort of reuse modules or materials in construction. So recycling, of course. So substitution of non-renewable resources by renewable, mostly bio-based resources. So greening production, and the 6th parameter is sort of rescaling of change and loops to more local and regional levels. So I don't know if you know anything about the circular economy, then you're probably familiar with these R strategies, of which there are many. And then we've tried to compress them into sort of 4 R strategies, and then there's 2 additional strategies called greening, cleaner production, and rescaling. So in each of these parameters have effects in different locations. So consumption spaces, business sites, business parks, industrial zones, and also rural areas. But we've found that for the Netherlands, there's not going to be, so even if you shift to more bio-based resources, it's probably not going to be produced and grown in the Netherlands. At least that's what we expect. So there might be, more secondary material from forestry or from agriculture as well, but sort of primary production aimed at or at bio-based resources, we don't expect that to be major in the Netherlands. So yes, so this is sort of an impression of the first scenario, so-called global corporations. So this is what we imagine the world to look like in 2050. And that's sort of characterized by sort of materialism, consumerism. So there's not going to be any changes in the patterns of consumption. So that's why you see all these minuses in the first 2 strategies parameters. But there is also this belief in green growth. So there'll be loads of recycling in this scenario, and also substitution by renewable bio-based resources will be big, and you'll invest heavily in greening and cleaner production. And the scale of change and cycles will be very sort of international. So in terms of space, so this is what we would imagine this to look like, right? So there'll still be sort of these major flows of materials and goods which come together in mostly in sort of business parks and industrial zones. So there's, in terms of consumption spaces, there's not going to be many changes. So there's of course a move to more e-commerce, digital technology, but other than that, not so much. But then there'll be a lot of changes in business parks and business sites. So there'll be more recycling there. There'll be a growth of distribution centers and also data centers, digital infrastructure. There'll be a high demand for office space to accommodate sort of business services. And then there'll be a lot of pressure on industrial zones and ports. So they'll have to grow quite significantly. So the fossil fuels, fossil materials, which there's a lot of this in the Netherlands, especially here in Rotterdam. So we've got loads of refineries and sort of chemical industry here. But that will all have to be phased out and were replaced by sort of processing of bio-based resources by chemical recycling, and there'll be an enormous growth of sort of energy-related activities like hydrogen, offshore wind, maybe nuclear energy, and also carbon capture, storage, and utilization. And then there'll be a continued growth in logistics. So then the second scenario is called high-speed worlds, and that would look like this. So it really embraces sort of digital technology, and there'll be a shift to an experience economy, right? So it's no longer a materialist scenario. but there'll be a move to consumption of experiences through digital technology. So sort of virtual reality type of stuff. And then there's this strong belief in technological solutions. So this eco-modernism is big here. So you'll see shifts in the consumption. So the material consumption will decrease somewhat. There'll be more reuse, repair, and also recycling to some extent. But sort of these, and then there'll be a lot of technological innovations to facilitate the substitution by renewable bio-based resources and the greening of production. And you'll also not do much in terms of rescaling chains and cycles. It's still quite a globalized scenario here. So sort of the material or the flows of materials and goods will be less, will decrease somewhat. And there'll be some changes in consumption spaces, mainly through the growth of online shopping and growth in the sharing economy. And there'll be sort of more finely grained logistics, which will have to have a place in consumption spaces, sort of in urban areas. And business sites, business parks. So we would expect there to be a mix of activities there. So the borders between sort of what is consumption and what is production will start to blur here. So this concept of business park might lose some of its relevance here. But there'll be activities like repair, refurbishment, recycling, sort of custom manufacturing, maker spaces, increase in data centers, digital infrastructure, of course, but a lot less demand for sort of dedicated office space that will happen in spaces at home or in sort of shared spaces. And there'll be less pressure on these industrial zones and ports. So there'll be some growth in that, but not as much as in the previous scenario. Then we also have this sort of post-growth scenario. In which there's really quite firm limits to consumption and also production. So consumption will change quite radically. So there'll be at least about 40% less consumption of materials in this scenario. So you'll have to do, you'll have to aim for sort of to get to a level of well-being using a lot less materials. And as a consequence of that, you also have to do less in terms of recycling and the greening of production, but the substitution by so you can't do everything, or you can't. Well, anyway, you always have to add new materials to the cycle, and most of these new materials will have to be renewable bio-based resources. So you'll still do quite a lot on that. So here you see what we sort of an image which tries to capture what this may look like in spatial terms. So most changes will have to happen in consumption spaces, right? So there'll be a reduction in the number of shops because you'll consume much less. And there'll be much more sort of shared goods, mobility spaces, and I think another important feature of this scenario is yeah, sort of the sort of taking the 15-minute city to the next level, right? So the 15-minute city is about accessibility, but now take it to the next level and also take into account sort of energy use and the flows of transport of material goods, and try to optimize that as well. So into business parks, business sites, so they'll be much smaller, and they'll have to be nearer to urban areas and towns. And there'll be quite substantial shifts in the value chain for especially manufacturing, as you also take sort of the environmental impacts of transport of goods into account, and also try to limit those importantly. So that will mean quite big shifts. Yeah, so in industrial zones, we expect there to be a decrease in sort of land use. So the fossil materials will be phased out. There'll be some growth in the processing of bio-based resources, but not a lot. And also energy use will go down quite substantially. So there'll also be a lot less of that, and there'll be a reduction in sort of handling and warehousing of goods. So the last scenario I wanted to discuss with you is it's called regional roots. And here, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so here you really try to rescale the chains and cycles of flows of materials to the local and activities to the local and regional level. So there's this idea of eco-localism, which is an important characteristic feature of this this scenario. And then at the same time, you subordinate the economy to the local community, which means sort of less economic growth probably, and less innovation. So which then also leads to changes in consumption, and you will not see a lot of big technical innovations to apply these for greening, for the greening of industry. So that's what's shown here, and what that means is that again, those consumption spaces will change quite considerably. So it'll be much more geared towards the local level. There'll be also a lot more local production, craft production and repair, local repair, refurbishment, and sort of materials which will be sort of recycled and reused locally. And business sites and parks will have to expand considerably, especially if you reshore some of the manufacturing and production, which is now happening somewhere else. Yeah, and like I think somewhat similar to the sort of the high-speed world scenario, there'll be a much more of a mix of functions on business sites and parks. So in industrial zones, they'll shrink considerably. So again, fossil materials, the industry around that will have to be phased out. But other sort of heavy industrial activities based around sort of mineral resources, sort of concrete, for example, or and sort of metals, steel, that will still happen. But it sort of the orientation of these type of industrial activities will be much more towards national and regional markets rather than sort of European and international markets as it is at the moment. But there'll be some carbon capture and storage, but no other sort of large-scale investments in energy infrastructure. And sort of this port activities, logistic activities will also decrease quite considerably. So some conclusions. Hopefully I've not exceeded time too much. But yeah, spatial planning we think it has an important role to play in sort of creating and facilitating the changes across various locations, and which can then support also the transition to the circular economy. And that's especially true for consumption spaces, right? So if you want changes in the patterns of consumption to take place, then there needs to be these changes in these consumption spaces to accommodate that and to stimulate that. And the more you do in these in consumption spaces, the less you have to do in industrial zones, and the less you have to do in business parks and business sites. So business sites, business parks, it's likely that they will have to grow, and there will be more demand for land there as more goods and materials will keep circulating around the economy, right? But the requirements that these business parks and business sites will have to meet will have to change. So the most dramatic changes will be in industrial zones and ports. So if you move to a circular economy, then the fossil industry will have to be phased out. But what will replace that, right? So that's still very uncertain. So there's some prospects in processing of bio-based resources and chemical recycling, but it's still very uncertain. Yeah, there also will be shifts in international production and supply chains, as environmental impacts of transport are taken into account. So what will that mean? That's still very unclear. And well, I'll finish with this. So the scenarios, I think, are a very useful way to get a grasp of what a transition to a circular economy entails. And my understanding is that you'll be talking about what the future of Wales will look like this afternoon, and hopefully this presentation was useful and inspiring for that. So I'll finish with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emil. Very useful. There are certain similarities between Wales and our industrial legacy and our current industrial position with that of the Netherlands. And obviously these scenarios we do need to think about. Very insightful presentation. Thank you very much for that. Hopefully we do move away from a consumerist society. As Phil suggests, we spend a little bit more time outdoors experiencing rather than consuming products. And so those scenarios are very useful for us to think about. And obviously to transition to a circular economy, we not only need the firm level, the operational level projects that you guys are all working on, we need to think about at the policy level, at the spatial level, how we integrate activities that are inter-organizational with those national and actually Europe and worldwide scenarios that we should be thinking about and working to. So I think we've got time just to take one question from the floor. Have we got a question? I think we've got one there. Thanks, Laura.
Hello. As interesting as all this sounds in a way, my worry is that these trends of digitalization and atomization that were particularly catalyzed by the pandemic, but were there before already, are actually quite reactionary and anti-human because they make us increasingly isolated from one another. And I'm a freelance translator and interpreter, and people think that Zoom or Teams or CVP are substitutes for actually meeting people in person, but they really are not, especially if the technology doesn't actually work properly. So I was wondering if you thought that, what your thoughts are regarding that.
Emil, would you like to pick that up?
Yeah, well, let me first say that the scenarios, so we don't have any preference for one of the scenarios. They each have upsides and they all have downsides. And I think people vary in the extent to which they like scenarios. So yes, so I don't want to sort of give my personal opinion about which scenario I like best. But I share your fears about some of these developments. So those are most obvious in this scenario of a high-speed world. But on the other hand, these digital innovations or this digital innovations in digital technology and other types of technology, they also give new opportunities, I think. And it's kind of interesting to think through these opportunities as well as these threats. So that's what we've tried to do.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. The scenarios are presented, as we've tried to do on CAKE, is encourage people to take a test and learn approach. Technology should be there to enhance, to enable us to collaborate. One of the things that Phil pointed out in his presentations was that Zoom did help enhance that collaboration, but there is no substitute for meeting and engaging with people. So thanks very much, Emil. Excellent presentation. Great food for thought. And so we're going to move on now to go to one of our groups, the Cardiff Capital Region 5, which Katie's going to introduce. Thank you.
Very welcome.
Thanks, Emil.